Horatio Alger story to everybody now wants the lottery ticket.
And as you're going through this research,
Yeah.
I mean, you know how the story ends.
Yes.
But are there moments where you're thinking, they could have, here's an obvious off-ramp, here's a place where if only.
Oh, for sure. And by the way, I think there were moments where there were Cassandras in the room. So, the biggest question is, could you prevented a crash from happening in 1929? And then, if you didn't prevent it, what were you supposed to do in the moments after to prevent it from getting worse? So to me, the story of 1929 and this book is not just a story of a financial crash. It's actually the story of 1929, 1930, 1931, 1932, 1933, because it was a series of dominoes. The crash was really the first domino, and then a series of terrible policy errors along the way that made things extraordinarily worse, that ultimately ended in 25% unemployment in 1932 and the stock market declining in 1932 by 90%. And so the question is, if you're standing there in 1929, what could have you done? So President Hoover only becomes the president in March 4th, 1929. He doesn't have a lot of time to jump in front of the train. The Federal Reserve back then knew there was a problem. All the debates, you could see in the diaries and the memos that I found, they're all worried out of their minds that things are getting completely out of control. But they're so scared about the political ramifications of if they were to, for example, raise interest rates to try to tamp all this down, that they would somehow topple over the rest of the economy. And so what were you supposed to do? Now, I think the answer is you should have tried to just raise interest rates like crazy and try to effectively probably change the way the margin loans were being made. You could have prevented them
By the banks.
by the banks. I mean, the banks were loaning you put down $1, they give you 10. So you could have come in and said, nobody can take on more than 2 times leverage or something like that. Maybe that would have stopped it. But it wasn't just that. It was then you have this crash, which oddly enough, this was a surprise for me, takes the stock market down between October and by November 13th down about 50%. But by the end of the year, oddly enough, was only down about 17, 18%. But because everybody...
So it's a correction at that point.
It's a correction at that point, except that all of America had done this with loaned money. So when the stock dropped 50%, it wasn't just they had lost the 50% value of the equity that they owned. It was that they lost everything. All of a sudden, they're having to mortgage their home, they're having to sell their home, they have nothing. And so it almost created a sort of generationally scarring moment. And nobody had enough money to put it back in the market when it went up to only get to that 17% down moment.
So who are the predators in this environment?
Well, predators are an interesting sort of turn of phrase. Charlie Mitchell was a guy who ran National City, become Citigroup, largest bank in the country at the time. And he really invented the idea of credit and lending people money to buy stock. They called him Sunshine Charlie. He said, finance should be demystified. He believed you should be able to sell stock the way you sell a necktie. That was his phrase. And he really
Wouldn't
did.
work on me, but I get you.
He really did push this idea forward more than just about anybody else. Now the question is, was he a predator? That's a question mark still for me to some degree. And the reason I say that is uniquely, unlike actually a lot of the financial crises that we've lived with and panics and busts and things in the last, call it 50 years, most of the people, at least in the immediate aftermath of the crash of 29, didn't actually blame the bankers. They blamed themselves. A lot of people like to do finger pointing. We finger a lot of finger pointing after 2008. The banks, subprime mortgages, they shouldn't have, the predatory, this and that. It wasn't really till 31, 32, 33, as the economy really took a toll, that the sort of public bloodlust around the bankers even emerged.
Is it because of that transformation that you talk about, that it wasn't even okay to take a loan? So suddenly all these people who remember that,
right,
say that my stupidity, mea culpa.
I think a lot of people thought, that was on them.
So when we turn the clock forward.
Yep.
You said you believe that we have hopefully can learn some lessons that will allow us to avoid a massive crash.
Right.
When I think about America's fiscal environment, the lack of any decision to balance the budget,
Right.
just irrespective of, we know that these bills are coming due.
Right.
We see the costs of the interest service. Where do you think the Americans really need to buckle up?
Oh, so there's two issues here. So one is a political question and a fiscal question about the country.
Right.
So uniquely, by the way, there was a budget surplus in 1929, mind you. So we had very little debt back then. So any problem, any crash or crisis that we might have in the markets today will become more complicated than ever given our own debt. Because the thing we did learn from 1929 is when you have a crisis, what do? The lesson was you throw money at the problem. That's how you save the system. However, if you continue to keep doing that, you are going to have a different problem, and we are possibly in that problem. Given sort of our own debt, you can't take on. At what point do bondholders in the world say, you know what, America, I like you. I'll continue, lending money to you, but you're going to have to pay me a lot more for the risk that I'm taking because I'm not sure whether you people are going to pay me back. And I think that's a fundamental question. So that's the backdrop of all of this. The other problem is sort of where is the leverage in the system today? Every financial crisis is a function of leverage, too much debt. It's the match that lights the fire. What I don't know about today is I don't think we even have a good handle on where all the leverage is. Because post-financial crisis 2008, so much of the lending in America moved from the banks. It's not at the banks anymore. It's all in these private credit vehicles.
Yeah.
And there's no disclosure. And so we have no real conception there. And then there's a question of how connected or disconnected these private credit vehicles actually are even from the banks. Some of the banks are actually financing and leveraging up, helping the private credit folks. So that's where it all gets complicated, and it's all against the backdrop of this euphoric moment, which actually is demonstrably exciting as telecommunications and radio was in the late 20s, called
AI moment.
Called AI.
Yes.
And
yet, I mean, I'm easily as excited as you are about the underlying AI technologies and what they can accomplish. I'm really concerned of what appears to be the business model of the lead AI companies in the United States right now.
I think there's a real question about the economics of what's going on. I don't think if you really spend time talking to these CEOs, and most of them will not say it on TV, there is no way to truly pencil out the math right now on what they're doing. It's almost religious, right, in terms of the sort of scale of the investment. And there is a level of indiscriminate spending. And so invariably, it seems to me, not that we won't have AI in 20 years, just like the internet, we will have, in the late 90s, we had the internet.
And people use the internet.
And people use the internet. So this is not
but a lot of those companies went under.
But a lot of the companies went under. So there's a whole ecosystem of companies right now. And the question is, how many of those will still be here in 5 or 10 years from now? And will there be a hiccup or worse along the way? And I think it's hard to believe that there won't be.
We're in a moment where the US government is turning away from reportable data.
Yeah.
Is making it harder to get information you believe in, where the banks and BlackRock and others are saying, well, here's what we think is going on because we want you to at least have something as a proxy. What would be your clarion call? These are some regs we need right now because otherwise we're heading for peril.
I think we need demonstrable independent data coming out of the government. That's a clear and present danger if we do not have that. You just need people to believe, I mean, not like a religion, but you need to believe that the folks who are running these things are doing these things independently. So start there. I think that especially as the private credit, private equity, venture capital, crypto markets become a bigger component and feature of our economy, that there is real disclosure around those things, especially as they become part of people's pension plans and retirement plans. I mean, that's a sort of unique new element that's being sort of added into our universe. And I think we need to understand some of these transactions even that are happening now with the government and some of the chip makers and some of the different transactions that are happening between the large language models and the chip makers and how all of these things even work. Most people don't really understand it because they can't understand it because there is not enough data.
International environment complicate and undermine what the Americans can do?
Well, the question longer term is, are we going to be living in a G0 world, as you would say? And how much of the world are we sort of putting walls up around ourselves, and how bifurcated is the world when all is said and done? And if it's completely bifurcated and we are basically an island unto ourselves, that means that invariably things will cost more, there'll be less competition. But in terms of thinking about like a China or our relationships with the Middle East or others, where all of their money comes from, I think becomes more and more interesting. How much leverage do they have in their systems becomes important. But again, it depends sort of how interconnected or not we really are. Before